what we're going to do at this point is we're going to pick up now with the background of Puritanism. The Elizabethan settlement provides the initial background, but then Puritanism as a movement will then start to develop more in response to what all happens under the successors of Elizabeth I, and these are the stewards. So we leave the Tudors with the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, and now we move on to this. We now move on to the Stuarts. Now the first Stuart monarch was James VI of Scotland, who then becomes James I of England. And the reason for that particular succession is because obviously Elizabeth died childless, and James is the closest remaining relative by virtue of the fact that he was the grandson. Yeah, James VI of Scotland was the grandson of Henry VIII's sister, who had married, I think it was James IV. So it's through that dynastic connection then that James VI of Scotland comes to the throne as James I of England. Now, in the meantime, going back to the Elizabethan church for a moment, in the meantime, there are other churchmen within the Church of England who are fine with where the Elizabethan church was doctrinally. They were fine with that, as we mentioned a while back. Really, the 39 articles, which was really a revision of the 42 articles that Thomas Cranmer had edited. First, they were revised in 1563, and then they were revised in their final form in 1571. Well, the doctrinal state, theologically, they were for the most part aligned. And there were many churchmen within the Church of England, within that same ecclesiastical structure, as defined by the Elizabethan settlement, who believed that the Elizabethan settlement was a good start, but in their estimation, it didn't go far enough. They wanted reform to go further. Elizabeth I was content with where things were. Here's the settlement, active supremacy, active uniformity by way of this revised prayer book, the 1559 Book of Common Prayer, and all that entails. That's it, and that's as far as it's going to go. That's all the reform that really needs to take place. We are doctrinally Protestant, as defined by the 39 articles, and even the prayer book. But we are going to retain traditional ecclesiastical structures. We're going to retain episcopacy. We're going to retain traditional worship and devotional practices. Because what we're going to try to do as a national church, we're going to try to encompass as many in our country as possible. As a Christian nation that's defined by a national church, and in this case, a national evangelical church, we're going to accommodate as many Christians within the country as possible. That was the thinking behind the Elizabethan settlement. However, there are these other churchmen of various persuasions who thought, you know what? Yes, Your Majesty, you got us off to a great start. We thank and praise God that Elizabeth and that government and that parliament got us off to a good start with respect to reform. We have reformed. We are an evangelical church, but now we need to go further. We need to go further to the point where we need to transition from. We now need to transition from the Book of Homilies, because as part of the Elizabethan settlement, they developed a second Book of Homilies. Well, we need to get done. We need to get beyond now just reading these written homilies on a rotational cycle of these churches, and we've got to now start with now sending ministers with exegetical skills who could actually start preaching the scriptures on a regular basis exegetically. We still have maybe one too many elements of traditional of the traditional late medieval church. Let's go ahead and get rid of some more of those things. One thing is, we've retained the use of candles. Let's get rid of that. All right. There are ministers who are still having ministers wear vestments. Let's get rid of some of that. And the prayer book is too much of a compromise. Let's make some revisions in that too. Preferably, let's be a little more like Cranmer's 1552 prayer book. Just to give some examples, they thought the queen did well for the most part, but now we need to go further. Now, probably one of the most controversial areas here, involving Elizabeth and then involving the ecclesiastical settlement, had to do. This kind of dovetails with some of the conversation that was taking place during the elders' meeting. Had to do with quote unquote prophesyings. Now, by the way, prophecy, as you've probably read in Perkins, his understanding of the word prophecy is a little different than what most likely will be talked about this coming Sunday. But again, to everything there's a context. Well, some of these churchmen, because they wanted to improve the level of preaching and the quality of preaching, and wanted to get beyond these books of homilies, held some special training sessions called prophesyings. Now, these prophesyings were meetings of ministers. They would meet about once a week or so in various locations, and and this group of ministers would preach on various passages to one another, and then one person would get up, he would preach, and then the rest of them would provide helpful feedback. And this would be the case of each person in that group. Now, this is a practice that had originated in Zurich. Now, during the reign of Mary Tudor, many evangelicals fled to the continent. One of the places where they went was Zurich, in addition to Geneva and Frankfurt, Strasbourg, and other places. And they learned this practice in terms of of learning what we would understand as expository preaching in this way. They learned this in Zurich. And so many of those who are in exile in Zurich, having learned this approach, brought it back with them to England when Elizabeth ascended the throne. Now, these were very controversial. Elizabeth was not interested in having these prophesyings at all. Now, immediately we can react and say criticize her for wanting to suppress preaching, and hence suppress the teaching of the Word of God. That wasn't really her intent. Now, the queen, quite honestly, did not like preaching. If during, she's attending when there's when she's in one of her sessions in Parliament, and or the court's assembled and there's a court preacher, if she thought the preacher went too long, she'd tell him that he went too long and he needed to cut it off now. And she would, oh yeah. Now why this aversion? And then why would she try to suppress these exercises among ministers? Well, it goes back to her central concern. The sermon, if not properly regulated, could be used to foment rebellion. That's what she's concerned about. And given the circumstances under which she came to the throne, the circumstances under which the Elizabethan settlement was passed and all the compromises that were made, it makes sense because, all right, if somebody's allowed to operate outside of these defined structures, then they could take something that could be very dynamic like a sermon and then use it to subvert public order. Suddenly somebody who can have free-handed preaching can start suddenly preaching against the queen. They could be a closet Roman Catholic and start trying to foment rebellion. So for that reason, she insisted on tight control and regulation of preaching. And as part of that, she strongly objected to these prophesyings. Now there was an Archbishop of Canterbury by the name of Edmund Grindal who was in sympathy with these prophesyings, and he wanted to encourage them. Not only did he want to encourage them, he wanted to become a regular practice amongst the clergy in the church. Well, Elizabeth tells him, she gives him a direct order to put a stop to these prophesyings. Well, Archbishop Grindal refused. And then he more or less, and then to add insult to injury, he rebuked her by telling her that she was operating outside of her proper sphere by trying to regulate preaching. Well, Elizabeth I, not being passive by any means, replied by suspending Archbishop Grindal from his duties. He still retained his office, but she suspended him from his duties and really placed him under a form of house arrest for the rest of his tenure as Archbishop of Canterbury. So that's kind of how she handled that. Well, I just bring this up because this would be one of the things that these other concerned churchmen were wanting to correct. So, in essence, all right, the Elizabethan settlement is okay. It was a good start. It's not enough. More needs to be done. We need to take this Reformation further. And there was a reason for it. Again, to everything there's a context. Now, obviously, none of us, I don't think any of us would be advocating for that kind of thing now. But as we discussed Friday, there were several reasons for that. One, when Thomas Cranmer came up with when he came up with with the first book of homilies to begin with, it was to make up for the fact that there were not very many trained preachers for the churches throughout England. That was one thing. And so in the meantime, as they're trying to get the two universities, Oxford and Cambridge, to the point where they could start producing more ministers who would be capable of this, of biblically expositing, the people in these churches needed some kind of regular and consistent instruction. And so therefore, the books of homilies were provided. Okay, if you don't know how to preach, if you don't know how to exegete Scripture, at least at the bare minimum, read through these, and in so doing, number one, you'll eventually learn to preach yourself by having an example. Number two, the people under your charge will at least have sustained teaching on various aspects of Christian doctrine and Christian life. Now, Elizabeth was content because then, as part of the Elizabethan settlement, a second book of homilies was produced to coincide with this first book. And quite honestly, she was perfectly content of just keeping things like that. Again, the reason being, she doesn't want as we would call in the U.S., she didn't want a loose cannon. She was afraid of there being a loose cannon, somebody who's going to go rogue, somebody who's just going to suddenly go off script, more or less, and start preaching whatever he wanted, at the risk of provoking some kind of disruption of the public order. So that would be her concern. And since preaching was the ecclesiastical activity that could be the most potentially subversive, she believed it was necessary to tightly curtail that. Now, she was not against all preaching, but she thinks, you know what? It just needs to be kept at a minimum. There's such a thing of less being more. Hence, whenever she was in court, when the court was opening, it was always customary to begin with a sermon before the monarch and their court. And as I said, she did not like long sermons. So if she thought a preacher was going too long, she would cut him off right in the middle and tell him, "Please finish now. You've gone long enough." Yeah. I would want to be preaching before that kind of audience. Yes, James.
How long was it customary to preach in those days?
That's a great question. In the 16th century, in a Protestant church, regardless of where it was, you were expected to preach at least an hour. An hour was enough. You were expected to preach an hour. If you went over an hour, that was too long. But then if you went under an hour, you were just a bad preacher. Very different times. So, those are just some examples. So, when Elizabeth I dies in 1603, she's succeeded by her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who now is James I of England. Well, these churchmen, whom we will call Puritans, were excited about James coming to the throne because he was raised in Scotland. And around 1560, the church in Scotland had accepted the Reformation. And very specifically, some aspect of the Genevan version of the Reformation, which was led by John Knox there in Scotland. And to make a very long and complicated story short, there was a Catholic monarch by the name of Mary Queen of Scots, who, because of several things, she was accused of having killed her husband, the Earl of Bothwell, who was James VI's father, and then she was accused of taking up with somebody else, and also a very intransigent Catholicism. And so, to make that very long and complicated story short, the Scottish nobles, who had embraced the Reformation, and an army that they arranged, drove Mary Queen of Scots out of Scotland into England, where she was kept under very watchful eye by her cousin Elizabeth. And actually, she was actually kept in prison, because that'd be the most. If you put somebody like that in prison, there's a potential rival to you. That's the most effective way of at least knowing where they are. So, she's in prison, and then, again, to make a very long and complicated story short, she's implicated in numerous plots to assassinate the Queen, and then 1587, Mary Queen of Scots is beheaded. Now, the funny thing, ironic thing is, this is kind of humorous. If you ever go into if you go to Westminster Abbey in London, you find their two sarcophagi, Elizabeth sarcophagi, Mary Queen of Scots sarcophagi, and they're placed right next to each other. I kid you not. It's the funniest. At least some of us think it's kind of the funniest thing, because they were diametrically at odds with each other. Well, anyway, her son James remained in Scotland, and he was raised by very staunch Reformed Protestants, especially people like Andrew Melville and George Buchanan. And so, because he was raised in this Genevan version of Reformed theology and practice and so forth, the Puritans were enthused that he was now going to be king, because they thought, he is one of us. These Puritans thought, wow, he is one of us. He's going to affect the kinds of reforms that we desperately need. He's one of us. And so, while he is making his way to take the throne in London in 1603, a group of these churchmen who want to reform the church further, who we will now call Puritans, because that's really what a Puritan was. Now, again, as I mentioned before, there is a long, sustained debate of about at least 40 years of what a Puritan is. Well, for our purposes here, without weighing into the minutiae of all that, we'll just say that the Puritans were Protestant churchmen in England who wanted to see the church further reformed. That now it seems rather generic, but that's how we'll define them, because as we'll find out, as we'll see in a moment, there were different types of Puritans, all of whom had a different idea as to what further reform was going to look like. But one thing they all have in common, we could say, and that is all these different churchmen wanted the Church of England, as defined by the Elizabethan settlement, further reformed. So these people enthusiastically meet the king while he is on his way to formally take the throne in London. And they present him with a petition. Your Majesty, we know that you are one of us. We know really that you're on our side. And because we know that you're on our side, because you're reformed yourself, you are Genevan reformed yourself, just like many of us are. Well, we know that you know where we're coming from, and we know that you're going to make the kinds of reforms that we really think need to be made to make the Church of England more biblical as we would understand it. And by the way, all those reforms are in this petition right here that we would like you to read. So they meet him while he's on his way there to give him this petition, and it's called the Millenary Petition, as you see there in your notes. The Millenary Petition, the reason why it's called the Millenary Petition is because it reportedly had about 1,000 signatures from these different churchmen. Well, the king is very coy. He accepts the petition. He proceeds to London, where he is then formally crowned King of England. So now, James VI of Scotland, also known as James I of England, is king of both England, and Scotland. So with that being the case, he responds to the petition that he received en route by calling a special conference at Hampton Court. Now, Hampton Court was one of the royal residences. Henry VIII got it from Thomas Wolsey. When Thomas Wolsey fell, Henry VIII managed to help himself to that estate, and then it became a royal residence ever since. Well, Hampton Court was now one of these royal residences, and James the First, and because we're dealing with England, we'll just call him James the First, he summons representatives of both the established church who want the Elizabethan settlement to remain exactly the way it is, and those within the church who want to reform the church further. Well, to their utter surprise, for the most part, the king shows himself to be very much opposed to the proposed reforms in this petition. Oh, you are not what? Ooh, surprise, surprise! You are not one of us after all. Absolutely not. Come to find out that James, with all due respect, hated his Genevan Reformed upbringing in Scotland. He hated it with a passion. He utterly despised it. He did not like these Presbyterians, to put it in very technical terms, cramming all these different things down his throat. He did not like these Presbyterians at all, and then he further disliked these Puritans who are proposing a Presbyterian type of church government as well. Get rid of episcopacy, replace it with a Presbyterian form of church government, make all these other changes. Well, the king was not very sympathetic towards that. On the contrary, he showed himself to be quite opposed, very vehemently opposed to it. However, one of the proposals that he did grant was that there be a new translation of the Bible. Now, time will not allow us to go into all the details of this, but there was already an official Bible translation by this time. It was the Bishop's Bible of 1568. But there was also an English translation produced in Geneva in 1560, known as the Geneva Bible. And the Geneva Bible is going to be popular among English Bible readers, especially Puritans, at least about the next 150 years or so. And so, the distinguishing feature of the Geneva Bible were these marginal notes. And some of these marginal notes were quite controversial. Like, for instance, there's a marginal note right next to the account in Exodus where the Egyptian midwives disobey Pharaoh's order to kill all the male babies that are born. And the note there, the marginal note there says something to the effect that sometimes it is not only allowable but even necessary, is actually even a commandment from God to disobey the king if he should tell you to do something that directly contradicts God's word. James was not happy with those kinds of marginal notes because they would undermine his view of royal authority. See, James held to a view of royal authority. He and his immediate steward successors held a view called the divine right of kings. And according to this view, which is even different from that of the Tudors, according to this view, a king is given his authority directly from God. Now, the Tudors, and again, this is where some nuance comes in. The Tudor monarchs understood that, yes, authority comes from God, but it comes from God through different human means. They understood for the most part, that God endowed the commonwealth, or the people of the commonwealth, with authority, and then through their various institutions, as they're guided by natural law, give that authority to the monarch, even though that authority is by scriptural mandate with respect to various things, including religion in this case. And also, there's this element. They also understood, the Tudors understood, that there was this necessary relationship between the monarch and Parliament. So the Tudors understood yes, the monarch has divine authority given by God, but as part of the legal constitution, there's a necessary relationship between the monarch and Parliament. That's different from the Stuarts' version of this. God gave the monarch, directly gives the monarch power to govern. And therefore, he could govern absolutely without a parliament, if he so wanted. Now, it just so happens that James I was a smart politician. So he decided, well, even though this is what he believed with respect to royal authority, he's going to use the machinery of Parliament to his advantage to get everything done that he wants. Well, all that to say, looping back to this for a moment, it's because of his view of royal authority that he really strongly disliked the marginal notes in the Geneva Bible. So the official Bible that was in existence, that was translated during the reign of Elizabeth I, was the Bishop's Bible. So the Bishop's Bible is technically the official Bible, English Bible at this time. Well, one of the Puritan representatives by the name of John Reynolds suggested this new Bible translation, and that there be a new translation of the English Bible. Here is what he was most likely hoping. Reynolds was hoping that the king would supplant the Bishop's Bible with the Geneva Bible. That's what he was hoping for. But the king, it seems that the king knew where John Reynolds was coming from, and so he responded to him by granting that a new translation should be produced, just not that one. So he orders that there be a new translation of the Bible. That would, to make a very long story short, this would be based on the Bishop's Bible, with some updating and changes and so forth being made in the text. And that inaugurates the process of producing what we now understand, what we now call the authorized version of the Bible, or what's popularly called the King James Version. And so, towards this end, between the years 1604 and 1611, under the leadership of Richard Bancroft, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury at this time, there are six committees placed in charge of translating various aspects of the Bible. So each committee would be responsible for one section of the Bible, and so in that whole process, without getting too much bogged down in the details, they are consulting Greek manuscripts, Hebrew manuscripts. They're consulting Erasmus. They're certainly they're consulting the Vulgate as well, because the Vulgate was still the Bible used by the scholars. It was still the translation used by the scholars, although it's going to be in conjunction with Greek and Hebrew and everything else. At the same time, they used the bishop's Bible as the basis for the translation. So all that to say, this is what went on in these 6 committees between 1604 and 1611. And so what we now know as the authorized version of the Bible, or the King James Version of the Bible, was then published in 1611. Now at this point, I think it's important for us to start examining the different groups of Puritans at this time. Now, as you see here in your notes, we're on the Jacobean period. By Jacobean period, we mean simply the reign of James I from 1603 to 1625. Now, just for the record here, this division is not hard and fast. It's not absolute, but it's just a general division that I think could help us as we try to navigate through the different groups of Puritans. One thing is for certain: Puritanism was not monolithic by any stretch of the imagination. In other words, there's not one central Puritan movement with a uniform code of beliefs and all of that. There are different groups. There are different groups of Puritans, all of whom have one thing in common, though. The one thing they all have in common is that they want to see the institutional Church of England as defined by the Elizabethan settlement further reformed. That's the main thing these groups have in common, although these groups of Puritans are very, very diverse. So it's important, before we start getting into what the Puritans did and so forth, it's important for us to understand that this is not, that the Puritans were not monolithic by any means, and that there were separate groups of Puritans. But they're all called Puritans ultimately because they had that one thing in common. That one thing in common is to further reform the institutional Church of England beyond what was defined by the Elizabethan settlement. So for our purposes here, I've come up with 3 divisions: moderate Puritans, separatists, and then Baptists. Moderate Puritans would be Presbyterians. There were those Puritans who are, by the way, these are all, for the most part, these are all members of the institutional church, for the most part. But these are members of the institutional church who just happen to believe that one of the necessary reforms should be the replacement of the church's government. Replace government by bishops with a Presbyterian form of church government, which, as we all know, is a government by elders through ascending councils. So in a Presbyterian system, you have the local board of elders. That would be called a session. A regional a regional group of churches in which elders from those churches would meet to decide matters of the church on that regional level. Those are called presbyteries. Then there might be a larger council of elders from churches from a larger region called a synod, and at the very top would be a council of elders from churches representing churches from all over the country, and that would be called a general assembly. So that's the kind of church government these particular Puritans wanted. They're part of the church, they're part of the institutional church, but they want to change the government of that institutional church from that of bishops to that of ascending councils of elders, as we've just described. Session, session, local church, presbytery, regional, larger regional, maybe a synod, and then at the national level, a general assembly. And probably one of the most famous examples of a Presbyterian Puritan within the English church would have been John Reynolds. But then, within the same Church of England, within the same institution, you have another group of Puritans. You have another subdivision of these moderate Puritans known as Independents. Now these Independents didn't want any centralized church government at all. These Independents believed that the Church of England should just simply consist of local autonomous churches, autonomous local churches, each with its own board of elders and pastors to care for the needs of the individuals within that body in that particular town or village or whichever. Now, examples of the Independents would be William Ames, William Bradshaw, and in the 17th, and then later in the 17th century, probably one of the most famous of Independents would be John Owen. And then we have Puritans who are Episcopalians. We have Puritans who want to retain episcopacy. They want to retain the institution of episcopacy, but they want to see other changes. Probably one of the most conspicuous. Now there are many changes. There are many other changes that Episcopalian Puritans wanted within that same institutional structure of the Church of England, but probably one of the ones they wanted the most was what they considered more doctrinal consistency. Come down hard on what will later be Arminianism. Come down hard on that, and also keep the prayer book, keep the elements of traditional worship and devotion, but let's make a more concerted effort to keep taking Catholic elements out of it. So that would be kind of the Puritan orientation of those whom we would call Episcopal Puritans. And probably one of the most famous of these would have been James Ussher, who was the Archbishop of Armagh in Ireland. So those are the moderate Puritans. Oh, that's a great question. Arguably, we could say that the Puritan movement started in 1570, when the Regius Professor of Divinity at Cambridge, by the name of Thomas Cartwright, gave a series of lectures on the Book of Acts. And it was during the lectures on the Book of Acts where he advocates for a Presbyterian form of church government, and that's because Thomas Cartwright, during the reign of Mary Tudor, had spent time in Geneva. He had spent time in Geneva, and he had traveled around there in Geneva. He had even gotten ordained in Geneva, even early on in the reign of Elizabeth. And so when he was appointed to teach at Cambridge, he gave these lectures on the Book of Acts where he's challenging that whole form of church government. So we could arguably say, Samuel, that what we call the Puritan movement probably most likely has beginnings around 1570, when Thomas Cartwright delivered those lectures on the Book of Acts at Cambridge. Now, he obviously incurred some consequences for that. He lost his chair, and he went back to Geneva for a while, and came back to England. Cartwright. So Cartwright is traveling around England, there in Geneva. He comes back, and then he's involved with some sort of subversive Presbyterian congregations in England as well. And what's interesting in the Elizabethan period, before 1570, the conflict is going to be with the Protestant English church establishment and and Catholics. So there's a huge literary war that's going on back and forth between English churchmen who are part of the Elizabethan church, and then Catholic exiles on the continent. So you have that so from about 1559 to 1570, that's what you have. That's the main aspect of the polemic. The debate is going to be between English Protestants defining and defending what the Protestant Church of England is, not only domestically but also internationally, by way of polemic with Catholics. So you in this case, English-speaking Catholics. Then, from 1570 onward, we do see the debate kind of shifting somewhat, although they're still having polemics with Catholics, but much of the debate shifts to, you're right, reformers debating other reformers, Samuel, in terms of what further reform for the Church of England would look like. Well, they had they certainly had gifted writers in France. I mean, certainly in addition to Calvin, there's Verret, there's obviously Theodore Beza, who was Calvin's successor in Geneva, also French, and a very significant theologian in his own right. So it's not that France had any lack of gifted Protestant theologians. On the contrary, they had many. Likewise with Germany. Now it's interesting. You bring up the Lutherans in Germany. There is something like that going on among some of the Lutherans in Germany, namely at the end of the 16th century, between the so-called Gnesio-Lutherans, who are advocates. They think that they're the defenders of Luther's pure theology and so forth, and then the so-called Philippists, who are regarded as more moderate Lutherans, who are led by Philip Melanchthon. So you had something like that taking place. Now one of the differences one of the factors that would contribute to the differences would be, in France, Protestantism never became the national form of Christianity for France. That's one factor. So it's always been Catholic. There was a brief moment when Henry IV in France, who was a Huguenot, was in line to be king, but he had to give up its Protestantism and become Catholic in order to become king. So, notwithstanding that, the definitive expression of Christianity in France was never Protestant. And in the Lutheran lands, one thing we have to remember, that there is no unified nation of Germany until around 1870, due to the work of Bismarck. So up until the 19th century, you have no nation of Germany. You have no German nation. You have Prussia, but then you have a whole conglomerate of autonomous German states, one of which happened to be electoral Saxony, where Luther was. And so what's happening there is they're battling out as to whether each of those little territories, each of those states, is going to be Protestant or Catholic. And then if you're going to become Protestant by the latter part of the 16th century, well, which is it going to be? Are you going to be Lutheran or going to be Reformed? It's funny in this regard, you mentioned the Heidelberg Catechism. The Heidelberg Catechism was actually, and it becomes very apparent when you read it, it's actually kind of a mediating document between the Reformed and the Lutherans there in that part of Germany, where the elector converted, well, not converted, but he changed from Lutheran to Reformed. But there are many moderate Lutherans following the Philippist strain of Lutheranism who are in that area around the Palatinate, of which then Heidelberg was the center. But that was another situation, though, in which, all right, is that territory going to become Protestant? Is it going to become Lutheran? I mean, not Protestant. Is it going to become Lutheran or is it become Reformed? And then, if it does remain Lutheran, which branch of Lutheranism is it going to be? Is it going to be the hardline Gnesio Lutheran version of it, or is it going to be the more moderate Philippist version of it? Well, the Heidelberg Catechism kind of reflects kind of a mediation between the Reformed and these moderate Philippist Lutherans. So that would be another example. So coming back to England here, the difference here is that in England, you have an established national Protestant church for the entire country. And so now, here we are, we're all members of this large national church. And the question is, what is this going to ultimately look like? Well, you have this group who thinks, well, Elizabeth did a great job, so let's just keep it as it is. You have another group who says, no, it was a good start, but it's not enough. We need to go further. Okay, wonderful. If we go further, what is that going to ultimately look like? Are we going to keep bishops? Are we going to replace bishops with councils of elders? Or are we just going to make every church independent and autonomous? So those are really the questions. So those are the questions that are being debated there. So all that to say, because in neither of those contexts do you have an overarching national religion. Do you have the kinds of conflicts there necessarily that you're going to have in England? Because in England, it has to do with what the final definition and shape of one comprehensive national Protestant church is going to look like. Now, and that's true, but there is a caveat, however, that even in England, there are going to be limitations on the kinds of things that can be published. Because even in England, if somebody is seeking to publish something that has the potential to subvert the public order, either ecclesiastically or politically, or most likely both, that's going to be stopped. And so the separatists, for instance, they're not going to be able to just go to a printer that's licensed by the monarch and say, oh, here, by the way, here's this treatise just really denouncing the entire Church of England and some of the members of Parliament and some members of the court. Could you please publish this? Could you please print this up and circulate it? Well, obviously, if a person like that is even caught, they're going to be sent to the Tower, or to some other kind of jail, and possibly in that context even tortured. So you're right, though. There's a certain degree of freedom, but that freedom in England is certainly going to be limited, because there's no way the authorities are going to countenance the circulation of pamphlets and things like this, which could prove to undermine the the regime and in public order. Now, it's for that reason that printers had to be licensed. Printers had to be licensed by the crown. And so, if you're licensed by the crown, then you're free to publish. If you're not licensed by the crown, you're going to be trying to publish. You're going to be printing things like this, surreptitiously, and operating kind of an underground press. Sometimes that was done from some sympathetic spot on the continent, or somebody there in the country in some remote place would have had some kind of a press. But all that to say, Mikey, what you're saying is true. But just to add that other caveat, it was also tightly regulated by the government. There's no way that a government licensed printer is going to circulate a tract by a separatist. Good, great comment though. Thank you for that. Now, so those are the modern Puritans. Now we come to the separatists. The separatists were those Puritans who give up on the entire institution of the Church of England altogether. They give up on the entire church-state establishment altogether. It is utterly corrupt, therefore apostate, thereby ultimately under the control of Antichrist. And so what we need to do is we need to separate from the entire thing, the entire church-state establishment, and bring about the church anew. And to bring about the church anew by way of separate, gathered congregations of regenerate of what we'll be able to determine will be a totally regenerate membership. Now, probably one of the prime examples of the separatists would be John Robinson. Now, who is John Robinson? Well, John Robinson would be the pastor of those we know as the Pilgrims. The separatists, among the separatists, will be those who, in early American history, will make their way on a ship called the Mayflower across the Atlantic from the Netherlands. That was one of the places where they went as they were escaping sort of enforcement of the church-state establishment under the Stuarts. They had boarded a ship called the Mayflower, and these were the ones who would make their way across the Atlantic and would establish a colony in Plymouth. The Pilgrim, whom we in early American history call the Pilgrims, were among these separatists. Now, their pastor was John Robinson, and John Robinson never left Amsterdam. He never left the Netherlands, but he exerted significant influence on many of those who would be the leaders of the Plymouth settlement, especially John Bradford, who was the first governor of what was called Plymouth Plantation. So, yes, Issachar.
It's the first question. Does that story have a connection with Thanksgiving?
It does, actually, which in my country has come under severe attack. But yes, to answer your question, Issachar, yes, it is with that band of Christians who sought to establish a society in the New World where they could, as a community, as a small society, worship God in the way that they believed the Scriptures commanded. And to make that, and they left in 1620. They left Amsterdam in 1620. They arrive. It's interesting, is of course, that their original destination, or their intended destination, was Virginia, and the Mayflower was thrown off course, and they ended up in what is now Massachusetts, which was not their intended destination. And so, as the story goes, they had that during that first winter in 1621. Winter of 1621, they had many of them had suffered from privation. Many died. Many also died on the voyage from across the Atlantic. And then there were Native Americans who helped them. One of them was named Squanto, who had contact earlier with English speaking people. He himself had converted to Christianity along the way, and so he was among the Native Americans who did help the Pilgrims. They taught them how to plant corn and things like this, to fish and to hunt and to survive in that particular climate. And then the following fall, around in that fall of 1621, the Pilgrims held a feast in which they praised and thanked God for having enabled them to survive that winter, in which then many of the Native Americans joined them. Now, that's how these separatists, known as Pilgrims, play a role in what we call the first Thanksgiving. Now, I have to resist the temptation into going into too much details about this, because we want to get done with our survey here. But there is controversy because in my country there are people who are more or less resisting our history, because the charge is that our history privileges those who settled and engaged in conquest and certain aspects of conquest and all that, and oppressed other peoples. Now, as always, things are very complicated. On the one hand, even coming back to the Pilgrims, what happens is when we talk about that, and we should, but also there is as Christians we can understand this. There is what we call total depravity. Human beings go to war with each other over land. They go to war with each other over other things. Well, that happened with the Pilgrims as well. I mean, you end up with the Pequot War. You end up with the Pequot War, King Philip's War in the 1670s, and so all that to say. So I just wanted to bring that because on the one hand we have to avoid two extremes, which in my country people are less inclined to do. On the one hand, you've got one group of people who think just get rid of the Pilgrims altogether. Let's not even talk about them anymore, except as horrific imperialists who oppressed all the natives, stole their land and whatnot. And then you have the other extreme, which then seems to canonize them as hand-painted or plaster saints. Oh, wow, they could never do. Oh, here are the Pilgrims. Aren't they wonderful? Aren't they great? Oh, they're so godly. They could do no wrong. Well, historical reality, brothers, as we all know, 90% of the time is somewhere in the middle. And as Christians, if if we have a biblical worldview in which we factor into the equation the reality of total depravity, yes, which manifests itself even among Christians, as we all know, then we could approach some of this more realistically.